Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope everyone is having a lovely Thursday. My name is Monte Glanzer. I'm an audit partner with Hanson Weeble. And again, our topic today is preparing for audits and other test services. I really don't think that my comments on this topic are going to be anything really groundbreaking or new, but I think it's going to be a good refresher on some tips and tricks to follow to try to make the audit process or other services go faster and smoother. Um, I primarily do audits, so that's kind of like where my comments will typically kind of lean to. But as the presentation implies, they can also be applied to other attest services. So what are other attest services? So to kind of be brief with this slide, a test service is when an independent CPA looks over your company's financial statements, and we would issue a report that goes along with those financial statements. And examples of test services are going to be audits, but also reviews and compilations. And the biggest difference between those three types of services is going to be the level of assurance that is provided with that service. So audits are going to be our highest level of assurance. We call it reasonable assurance that the financial statements are in accordance with their basis of accounting. And really, it's the highest level of assurance because of the extent of testing that we do and the amount of evidence that we are required to gather to be able to substantiate our opinion. And because of the level of testing that we do and the time it takes, it is the most expensive and most time-consuming of the three services. Reviews are kind of a step down. We call that limited level of assurance, and the procedures are a lot scaled back from an audit, primarily focusing on inquiry. So we ask a lot of questions, and then also analytical procedures. So looking at relationships between accounts and historical trends and things of that nature. And then compilations actually provide no assurance because we are not required to validate any of the information that you provide us, other than making sure that the financial statements are presented in accordance with GAAP or whichever basis of accounting is being used. But regardless of the services being provided, what we go over today can still be beneficial from a day-to-day perspective, and also kind of looking at the service that you're going to be receiving at year end. So how best to prepare? Kind of 5 general topics that we'll kind of dig into a little bit. And so the first one is on year-round preparation. So in my opinion, being ready for an audit means having quality accounting practices and procedures in place to properly record and document all day-to-day transactions. That sounds like a very clinical definition, but it's really the groundwork, the ground floor of preparing accurate financial statements and providing accurate financial information to owners and or shareholders. And that kind of information gathering, recording those transactions throughout the year, it can't be done at year end. It's a year-round process. And so, like I said, it's kind of like the base ground floor, first layer of building financial statements. But it's also really important to periodically review internal financial statements to make sure that balances make sense, or that if there's variances between accounts, they're either expected or you can reconcile them. And looking at financial statements, ideally, you're going to have some kind of comparison. So either a month to month, the current month versus the previous month, or maybe or in addition to maybe a year to date to last year to date. So some kind of comparative analysis. You can see where you've been and where you currently are. And so highly recommend a monthly review of financial statements. Most organizations focus on income statements and like budget to actuals on expenses, or revenues to revenue projections or forecasts and what the bottom line is. And all that is really important and useful information. But actually also reviewing the balance sheet can just be as important, and also can impact the income statement if changes need to be made. An example of this could be that you know that you paid an annual insurance bill this past month, and then you're looking at the monthly balance sheet and notice that the prepaid insurance account didn't change from the previous month. So hopefully a bell will go off saying, hey, well, I paid this bill, we really should have had an adjustment there, and then you can kind of investigate why, what happened with that transaction. And also, it may be okay not to focus on certain accounts on a month-to-month basis, especially when they're only adjusted maybe once or twice a year. A good example of this is going to be the allowance of doubtful accounts for accounts receivable. If your policy is to evaluate the collectability of accounts receivable and make an adjustment at year end, or maybe it's twice a year, that is perfectly fine. We have a lot of clients that do it that way. It makes it more efficient and not have to go through that process every month. But then the expectation when reviewing the balance sheet each month would be that allowance account would not change throughout the year or from between adjustment periods. And if it does change, then you can investigate why. So the point there is to kind of have an expectation of what balance sheet balances should or could be, and then kind of investigate as necessary. Another key procedure is reconciling to third-party statements. So most notably is going to be bank reconciliations, and hopefully they're being done monthly on a timely basis, because if they get backed up and you're doing 2, 3 or more at one time, it's harder to reconcile that way, and it also creates more headaches, in my opinion. Additionally, making sure that any notes payable, loan balances, or lines of credit, that the balances on the general ledger in your accounting records agrees to what the bank is reporting on the monthly bank statement. Which it seems like is a very simple concept, but mistakes can be made, and sometimes they might not agree. And then finally is reviewing your accounting policies and internal control documentation periodically to make sure that it's up to date. And if you don't have any kind of written out control narratives or the process of how transactions are recorded, I think it's important to go ahead and do that, especially if you're having an audit, because we ask for that documentation, and then we evaluate that documentation against what we actually see is happening when we're doing our testing. So that's an important thing to keep on top of to make sure those are up to date. So the next kind of topic on preparing for audits is about communication. So we look for year-round communication with our clients as much as possible. But about the audit itself, you really should work with your auditor on communicating and coming up with what the expected timing of when the audit should start, when drafts of the audit report should be due, and then when finals are expected to be handed out. Really just establishing the timeline and putting dates on those milestones to help us and to help you plan for the audit, and also to keep track of the progress as the audit progresses. And then providing updates of new developments. So to me, that essentially means that the auditors want to know what's going on. And if there's large or unusual types of transactions happening during the year, let us know so we can kind of make note of that. And better yet, if you want to get our opinion on or ask questions about the accounting treatment of those transactions, we love to be able to answer those types of questions in the moment when you're kind of going through it, or when it's maybe fresh in your mind, and kind of work through those issues at that time, versus us asking about, well, why did you treat it this way, or why did you put it in this account 6 months later, or when we're ever doing the audit, because it kind of halts our progress to kind of pushing through, and so we can kind of get to that transaction and say, oh yeah, we covered that, and we have the documentation that we can put in and move forward. So request lists. So whatever type of service you're providing, hopefully you're getting some type of request list. And if you're not, you should be asking your CPA for one. So essentially what the request list is, it tells you all the work papers, document and other documentation that we're going to need to complete the audit or other attest service. And it's usually not going to be a complete list, because there's always other things as we get through testing. We say, well, can we compare that to this type of report? Or there's things that we need to ask for that we can't go ahead and put on that request list, but it's going to be a large chunk of what we need. And having that information available, at least the list of the information, allows for you to kind of gather that information beforehand. And as an auditor, starting field work with most of the information that we're going to need for field work on the first day of field work is wonderful, and it allows us to be way more efficient and get through information faster. And so definitely look for or ask for a request list if you haven't seen one before. And for us, we've been using a cloud-based platform for our request lists, which has been a huge improvement over the way we had done it before, which is usually a Word document or Excel document. But essentially, it allows us and our clients to both see the list and see what has been provided and what is still outstanding in real time. So there's no dispute about what has or what has not been sent over, and so it is saved a lot of headache, saved a lot of time. So you can ask about that too if there's a cloud-based version for a request list. And as I mentioned before, please ask questions, especially throughout the year. Let us help work through those issues before the audit starts, so it helps us kind of keep our momentum in getting through the audit. And if there's questions about the audit process itself, you can ask those questions too. We can't let you know all our secrets, but we can certainly help you understand why we might be performing certain types of procedures or reviewing certain types of documentation. And that last bullet point, it's important to be available during whatever service is being provided. We don't want you to come to agreement on when field work needs to happen, and then you take PTO for half that week or are unavailable because of meetings happening. And I'm not saying you have to clear your entire schedule, but the more available you can be to help with additional requests or other questions, help us answer other questions that come up, the faster we can get through the information and completing the audit. So the next section is on documentation. And it sounds pretty straightforward, simple, but knowing where to find documentation is huge. Most organizations have places where they file invoices or other documentation to support the day-to-day transactions, but knowing where to access that documentation, whether it be electronically on your network or hard copies in which file cabinets, just knowing where to find that and access that information when we request it will save a lot of time. What does get people into trouble sometimes is documentation on journal entries. So this is a scenario that is not great from our perspective, is when we ask for documentation on a selected journal entry and the response is, well, I don't have anything. My boss told me to book that entry. that doesn't give us the warm and fuzzies as far as audit evidence or documentation. There should always be a work paper, a report, even an email to support a journal entry. I mean, there should be some kind of backup to justify what the amount was and what the accounts that were affected by that journal entry. Estimates are always going to be a main focus, especially in an audit, usually because they involve a lot of judgment from management and a lot of inputs that create the estimate. So I think it's very important to develop a reasonable methodology for the estimate. And this is another great example of asking questions throughout the year. I mean, you can kind of put together a methodology for a certain type of estimate and send it to us or your CPA and say, can you just take a look at this? Does this make sense to you? Is there something I'm not considering? I think that is a huge help. So developing that reasonable methodology and then documenting it, which could be in a Word document, or it could be in the Excel document or whatever that's wherever you are doing the actual calculation for the estimate. So examples of estimates that we usually see are, again, the allowance of doubtful accounts for accounts receivable. There's a lot of judgment involved in determining which accounts or which invoices might need to be allowed for, or maybe it's like an overall percentage. Whatever the methodology is, there's definitely judgment involved in getting to that calculation. Or for nonprofits, another estimate could be the allocation of functional expenses, which has a lot to do with how people spend their time and kind of allocating compensation as well as other things. So again, a lot of judgment and other inputs that are needed for that calculation. And so having a work paper for those types of estimates, or any estimates, that provides analysis of what the estimate is and how it was determined is going to be huge and help us kind of work through the audit more efficiently. And I understand, so that last bullet point, work papers can be put together and then at the last minute, maybe something changes or needs to be updated before the audit begins. So it is extremely helpful to double check that the supporting work papers still agree to that general ledger before they're provided to us. It always creates delays when we get work papers that either don't agree to another work paper or to the general ledger itself, because then we would have to send it back and let you know why we're sending it back, and then you make the correction. And so it just creates delays when we could be moving forward. So try to double check to make sure that whatever work papers you're providing does agree to and does support whatever is on the general ledger. So this section is really about continuous improvement, I think. Auditors, I mean, we really do want to see your organization succeed. And a part of that is that we will provide suggestions or give feedback, and if as we see it, so if needed. And that feedback might be a better way to document a transaction, or improve an internal control, or even calculate an estimate, or document an estimate. And some of that feedback might be more informal conversation by, hey, can you come look at this work paper, and kind of tell you what we're thinking when we're reviewing it, or looking at a certain piece of documentation that we see to see how that might be improved. So it could be very informal, or it might take the form of a management letter comment, which is a very formal required piece of communication as far as audits go of internal control deficiencies. But however, the form of the communication, we do hope that you consider our suggestions and make changes or apply changes for next year. And part of that communication between you and the auditors could be about what the next steps might need to be taken to implement an improvement or to kind of take that feedback and how to apply it against what we are asking for. Because if we do take the time to go through a certain type of transaction and kind of talk through it and say this is the appropriate way to record this transaction, and we kind of make the adjustment 1 year, and then we come back the next year and we see that same type of transaction was done the old way, the wrong way. I mean, it's frustrating for us for sure, but it takes time to again correct that, to point it out, to say, remember we talked about this last year. So anytime we can avoid making those same types of mistakes twice, it's going to make the audit go much faster and overall just be, and then throughout the year, then your financial statements will be more accurate with having the correct way to record those transactions. And so our last topic is just on accounting updates. So it's definitely important to be aware of accounting updates that will be effective either now or in the future. And this is an area that I think your CPA can be a good resource on. Each year, we definitely try to let our clients know what accounting updates are going to be applicable to them, and we try to talk about when it's gonna be effective and how they might prepare and implement for that change. Now, how frequently accounting changes or updates are coming out will depend on which basis of accounting you're being used. The generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, are going to have way more accounting updates a lot more frequently than some of the other bases of accounting listed there. So if your income tax basis or cash basis, I mean, you still need to make sure that you're aware if any updates are happening, but it's going to be happening a lot more frequently if you're under the GAAP basis of accounting. And so when you do hear about an accounting update, you should first understand who it's affecting. So what types of organizations, what types of transactions. So does that update impact public or private companies? If it's only public, that might not apply to you then. But a lot of updates usually are applicable to both. Is the update for a nonprofit, which maybe you don't work for a nonprofit, so it may be not applicable to you? Or does it involve certain types of transactions or account balances that are on your general ledger? Then you might need to understand more about that. So not all accounting updates are going to apply to your organization, so it's important to kind of understand that piece of it first, and then understand when the update is going to be effective, because it could be effective for a calendar year, or which is going to be a little bit different than a fiscal year. A lot of nonprofits have fiscal year ends of June 30 or 9/30. So understanding when it needs to be implemented is going to be important. And then understanding what you need to do about it. What is the change that's being implemented, and then how can you put it into your financial statements and your procedures, your general ledger. And this is where I think your CPA can definitely help. Again, we try to work with our clients each year, let them know what accounting updates are kind of coming down the road. The biggest one lately is the GAP standard for leases. It's a new standard that's effective for 2022 calendar years, 2023 fiscal years. So that's the biggest one that impacts a lot of people, nonprofits included. So if you don't know about that you should ask your CPA. But so I think that CPAs can be a huge resource in kind of being aware of accounting updates. And if you are a CPA yourself, hopefully you're going to see a lot of these as you're getting your CPE throughout the year. And I believe that is the end of my talking points, and I will kind of turn over to Rebecca back to see if there's any questions that have come up.
There aren't any questions currently in the chat, but does anyone have a question now that they didn't put in the chat? Oh, here's one coming. It says, how do we get a request list?
Well, first I would ask the CPA that you're working with and ask them to provide a request list. And like I said, it can be, we've been primarily using a web-based platform. So you'd get basically an email inviting you to log in to this website, and that's where you'd see the checklist. But we have used just Word documents or Excel files, just essentially just listing out what we need. And so I think that the first place to start would be to ask your CPA to help build that. And you can work with them if you haven't used one before. You can definitely work with them and kind of work together and say what is needed and what you can provide.
But for us, that's something that we give standard, correct?
Yeah, I think it's pretty standard practice at Hanson Weeble to provide request lists for I would say for all three of the test services that I mentioned. Definitely for audits, because it's the most voluminous of the requests, so for sure.
Any other questions? All right, it seems pretty quiet now. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and thank you, Monte, for sharing that great information. I will be sending a copy of this recording and a copy of the slides to everyone who's registered. So you all can be looking for that in your emails. And then as well, if you have any questions that come up later, please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer those questions. Everyone should have my email address because you've been receiving emails from me. And you can go ahead and just send those questions to me, and then I'll pass them on to Monte as well. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.